I think for our children to realise that there was a bit of a revolutionary period that happened right here has got to be an inspiration.
There's almost a sense of pride as well, really, to think that something so influential could come from a place so obscure, really.
With the successful sinking of Hetton Lions, it proved very good quality coal, and this was the start of the opening of the whole of the coal fields of East Durham. "70 years ago, standing at the engine shed, looking up from down there, and the bloke said, come up son, pull that lever there, have a ride, pull that lever there, and we'd be away." Amazing.
I think it's easy to forget. People under 35 can't remember a pit in the Durham coalfield. So it's easy to just like airbrush that out of history. We'll learn about other aspects of history, which is fine, but I think it's vitally important that people know where they come from, what the area was about, what built the area, what built the country.
There were very few people that lived here in the early part of the 1800s. The main occupation was farming, but there was a big hall here, which was Hetton Hall, and the Lyons family lived in Hetton Hall. The Countess of Strathmore had bought the land in 1746. The Strathmore family were married into the Bowes family. That was the ancestry of the Bowes Lyons, and I think it was the 14th Earl of Strathmore whose daughter was Elizabeth Bowes Lyon and eventually became the Queen Mother.
This was produced by Thomas Robson, and it was in 1823 that this poster, for want of a better word, was created. What we've got here is the strata that the sinkers had to go through and the engineers had to work out to go right through the magnesian limestone until they reached the coal levels at the bottom there. And it was a huge difficulties they had with the water, and it took them 2 years to reach the coal.
The east of Durham is covered by a limestone layer with underlying quicksands, water-bearing quicksands, and it was very, very difficult to sink a colliery through this water. Also, a lot of geologists didn't think that there'd be good quality coal underneath. John Lyon had tried on his estate unsuccessfully to sink 2 shafts, failed because of money problems and the cost of the sinking of it.
The problem was water. Water was a great enemy of the miner, but it was particularly a problem in the limestone area because it prevented the sinking of the shaft. And in fact, the first 10 years in the attempt to win the colliery at Hetton was a succession of failures, simply because they couldn't cope with the water problem.
Arthur Mowbray was well aware of the Hetton situation because for many years he'd been the superintendent of Sir Henry Vane Tempest Collieries, and he actually bought the information about the borings, so he knew about the geology. He had fingers in a lot of pies because he was also a banker. But one of his problems in 1815, the banks collapsed. His bank collapsed. His was a bank in Durham and Darlington and London called Mowbray and Company. And that bank collapsed in 1815, so he became a bankrupt. A lot of the advisors for Vane Tempest family didn't like Mowbray. They didn't like his overbearing nature, was I think one of the as a kind of words that were used. On the basis of his advisors not liking Mowbray, Stuart sacked Mowbray in 1819. Because he saw the opportunity of completing the partially developed colliery at Hetton, he started negotiating with the Hetton landowners and started getting together a partnership. Some were family, his son-in-law and his son-in-law's brother, also a nephew. Other people were people who'd worked for him in the Vane Tempest collieries who were coal experts, and others were lawyers in Durham City who Mowbray had come into contact with over the years.
We tend to remember those people where the bet had won. But there are many mining adventures in the coalfield and in the mineral mining in the Pennines where they were unsuccessful and they ended up in poverty, having lost their assets in this gamble to access the coal resources and had failed.
Effectively, the Hetton Coal Company was one of the first to develop shares which were traded and was the model for the joint stock companies of the 1840s, which of course were very influential in building the railways.
So the documents here are all from the Londonderry archive, from Lord Londonderry's archive. The thing about the Londonderry archive here is these documents actually tell us an awful lot about what happened in the formation of Hetton Colliery. So what we've got here are some documents from John Buddle. So John Buddle was Lord Londonderry's very famous engineer, but he was Lord Londonderry's agent, manager of his business interests.
Buddle didn't particularly like Mowbray and made sure that he took every opportunity to criticise the way in which the Hetton Coal Company were operating. Hence the words adventurers and madmen and pirates and things like that used in his letters.
Londonderry, these are rivals to Hetton, and it's really interesting to get John Buddle's views on what's happening, which is usually not very complimentary. Buddle's reporting daily, sometimes several times a day, to his lord and master. He's got a list here of the names of the partners in the Hetton Colliery, and he lists the names here. He lists how much money they've invested in the company, and then he has some comments. And so you get the likes of William Hetton here from Bishop Wearmouth. His solvency is even questionable. And then you've got William Stobart, has no money. And then it's a little bit of gossip at the end, married Hetton's daughter 3 months ago. And then you've also got Robert Watson Darnell, Bishop Wearmouth, and Mowbray's nephew, a brewer, has no money. So that's the sort of comments you get about the partners in the company.
I think the key issue is the tension between competing collieries, because there was a cartel trying to control the coal trade and keep the price up. Anybody trying to break into the market, the rivals tried to put them at a disadvantage.
The technology that they used was a technology which in the trade is known as cribs, and these were planking wedged in the side of the shaft to stop the water coming in. But at the end of the day, men had to go down this hole, hack the stone away, and attempt to tub back the inflow of water.
One of the contentious issues between Buddle and Mowbray was that Mowbray poached a lot of what Buddle called petty officers, the overmen and the deputies and the technical people from Rayton and Penshire to work on Hetton.
Fortunately, and contrary to the views of many of the leading colliery engineers of the day, the coal beneath the limestone was as pristine as it was elsewhere in the coalfield. For East Durham, it led to the development of the major collieries up the East Durham coast, which would last for another 100 or so years.
Buddle is not happy about what's happening with the success really at this point of Hetton. He's reporting on some meetings and what's happening in the coal trade. And then he has here, still, this splendid trade is ruined and will not be worth any gentleman's while pursuing in future as a gentlemanlike business as heretofore. It will fall into the hands of grasping speculators and neck-or-nothing adventurers in joint stock companies. I've been apprehensive of this ever since the Hetton Company got fairly afloat and other adventurers came into the field and have acted accordingly. And then he goes on to say about what his plan's going to be. He's going to back out of the trade and he's going to endeavour to spend the remainder of my days in tranquillity as a mere spectator of passing events.
The coal is worthless until you actually get it to its destination, and most of the destination for the Hetton coal was London and the southeast of England, because this coal had really little to do with the Industrial Revolution. It was domestic coal that were after. That was where the money was made. And the great advantage that Durham and Northumberland had was that they were able to ship the coal to London by water.
When the colliery company started, there had to be also a means of getting the coal to the coast and away for sale. And Arthur Mowbray, he wasn't able to create a lowland railway route. His rival coal owners all around him prevented that. So we've got a picture of George Stephenson here. This document's actually about the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which followed and is the one that most people have heard of rather than Hetton Colliery Railway. But that was 3 years later, and actually an awful lot of the work that Stephenson did on the Hetton Colliery Railway helped him to go forward and, you know, become really famous with the Stockton and Darlington.
The regional trade on the Wear was salt, which was eventually lost to South Shields. Now, the salt business came in the 1590s, mainly to avoid the trade restrictions in Tyneside, and salt involves using a considerable amount of cheap coal. And by the late 16th century, it was increasingly obvious there was far more money in coal than there was in salt. And then that takes you into the 17th century, and as the coal trade is beginning to develop, Sunderland enjoys a great stroke of luck, because with the outbreak of the English Civil War, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, Sunderland, which is by and large parliamentarian, tends to dominate the coal trade down the east coast. Railways faced a number of problems in this period, one of which of course was land rights, what's called way leaves. So it would involve legal obligations, it would involve negotiations with local landowners to establish way leaves, and then on top of that, of course, you had the geographical aspect.
They had to overcome two hills, the Copt Hill and the Warden-Law Hill. Warden-Law Hill was probably the highest point in the area, which was 634 feet above sea level. So to negotiate that, they had to have install two stationary engines, one at Copt Hill and one at Warden-Law, to draw the wagons up to the top of the Warden-Law, and then by self-acting inclines, 4 self-acting inclines, down to Northmoor, which is Silksworth, and then it was going to be locomotive hauled, or originally horse-drawn, from there down to Sunderland.
I think one important point here should be made. The books weren't written. By the 1820s and 30s, there were civil engineers, of course there were, but civil engineering and railway engineering was very much in its infancy.
Stevenson isn't the guy that gets his hands dirty. He's the guy that conceives the line of the railway, and he seemed to have a gift of going into a countryside and being able to immediately see, or after a series of surveys, being able to conclude where the best line of the railway was. Now, this is a skill which isn't common. So you needed a skilled workforce. Underground, you had a complete transport system, railways underground. You also had steam engines underground, would you believe? So you've got this massive transport facility underground before you actually get the coal to the surface.
This lovely document here, which was a promotional poster almost that the Hetton Coal Company had done, and you've got a lot going on this. First of all, you've got the route of the railway from the colliery here across what looks like a mountain, but it did have to go high, hence the fixed engines, over Warden-Law and down, and made its way to the coal drops at Sunderland.
Stevenson was working for the largest mining conglomeration in the world at the beginning of the 19th century, the Grand Allies, as it was known, which comprised of the principal coal mining owners in the region. The Grand Allies would appear to have allowed him a great deal of latitude, simply because they needed his talent, and he was in a position to go elsewhere because of his talents.
It was the start of railways as we know them today, really. It made people realise that locomotives and stationary engines and self-acting inclines were the answer. Hence you had your Stockton, Darlington, Liverpool and Manchester, and indeed railways all over the country and eventually the world.
And of course, Stevenson left Hetton before the job was completed, because he actually left the completion of his job to Robert Stevenson, his brother. Stevenson is headhunted by the Stockton and Darlington group, and actually in 1821 goes over to survey the Stockton and Darlington before Hetton is completed. And I think this caused a great deal of animosity in Hetton. It's interesting that there's no recognition made of Stevenson's work in the big lithograph that's produced to mark the birth of Hetton Colliery and Hetton Colliery Railway.
The likes of John Hopper, assistant viewer, got George Jowsey, master sinker, Ralph Day, master mason, and so on. So he's basically saying thank you to his workforce.
With the Hetton Colliery output and the new Ellymore Colliery and eventually the Ebbleton Colliery, they realised that there was virtually twice as much coal needed to be taken down the line. The locomotives of the time would only do 4 miles an hour, whereas a winding engine could do 10 miles an hour. So they installed 4 new static winding engines at Northmoor, on the flat between Wardenlaw and Cobtail, and Winters Lane at Sunderland, and then down to the stairs, so they could transport more coal down the line.
Well, over there, generally speaking, that's where the staithes were, and beyond them were the Lambton staithes. Of course, the two came together eventually. In the 18th century, this river would have been packed with usually 2-masted brigs. The brig was the standard workhorse of the coal export trade. The word staithe, I think, is a corruption of a Scandinavian word, statha, which simply means a bank. Because you can well imagine that in olden times, in olden days, in Viking days I suppose, vessels were loaded from a bank, a handy bank. And so staithe is nothing more than an artificial bank, that's all it is. Leading the railway or the wagonway out from the land, above a vessel, and disgorging coal from chaldron wagons directly into the hold of a collier.
In 1826, there were 2 engineers belonging to the Prussian government of the day, engineers who would be familiar with the Ruhr coalfield, came across to examine the transport facilities in England, the railway system in England. And they were astonished at what they saw at Hetton.
If you look at a graph of the exports of coal from Sunderland at this time, the 1830s certainly seems to be a big upsurge in coal export.
It is the achievement of winning the colliery, the achievement of getting unprecedented amounts of coal to the surface and then to market that staggered contemporaries.
My family goes a long way back in the local community, from the 1840s, that we think of because they were on the 1851 census. The very street we're on now, my great-great-grandfather was arrested in 1873 as part of the Brigard riots. 20 young men who had a slight uprising against the working conditions at that time. Fortunately, they didn't go to jail, so I've got long roots in the local community through both my mother and my father's side.
They needed to build housing in the first place, and the coal company built housing, which apparently cost £14 to build a house at that time. They were built from local stone, which was limestone, which is porous, so they would be damp inside. They had 2 rooms, one room with a coal fire and access to the loft space in the roof.
The family came because of mining. On my mother's side, the family came from Grassington, mining there, and on my father's side, they actually came from Killingworth, and they followed George Stephenson and the railways and the coal mining of the North Tyneside. In 1812, there were 212 people living in the wider conurbation of Hetton, as it were. Within 10 years, that had exploded into the thousands, so they had to build everything from scratch. In the early days, the Methodist chapels came into being, and other chapels. Then the Anglican churches came into being, and then in the late Victorian times, schools were built, predominantly funded through the coal company and sponsored through the coal company, and even the churches and chapels were sponsored by the coal company.
They built a community really around the chapels, and the ministers from the chapels had very good reputations. They were seen as very honest people. They became the check weighman at the pit, where the tubs full of coal had to be weighed, and in the early days they would empty the tubs out and not pay them if there was too much stone in and that sort of thing. So the reputable jobs were going to these Methodist supporters and ministers, really. The growth of the unions in the mine was an important thing. You know, they had no rights initially. They had to sign the bond, and which was them working for this particular company for a year. If they tried to disappear, they could be put in jail. So they had no rights, and children usually about 8, but we knew of children as young as 5 that were working down the mines. And there were no cages in the early days. You had to grab onto the rope and go down that way. There'd be more than one that actually fell off. It was an incredible time. They had to fight very hard to form their unions, and a particular guy was Thomas Hepburn. He was a Methodist preacher as well. He was the secretary of the first miners' union. After the first strike, they achieved an incredible thing. The working day at the time was 17 hours, and they managed to get that reduced to 12 hours a day.
In 1822, my great-grandfather's uncle, James, took an apprenticeship as a young man, aged probably about 16, where? In Hetton. And this is, to me, quite a personal phenomenon, really. Here is a young man born in 1806. By 1837, he's already sinking his own pit with his partner, Joseph Smith, at South Ox Hill. Now, surely that means that the seeds of that growth, that success story, and it is a success story for the Joyces, was sown here in Hetton, probably around the time of the opening of the railway. The Joycey family, I would say, is a classic product of the Industrial Revolution, where you have families further south in the cotton mills and in the other large centres of Yorkshire, where you get big families arising, making a lot of money and becoming wealthy and becoming a kind of new landowning class. Well, in 1911, the first Lord Joycey, and he is by then the first Lord Joycey, he was created the first Lord Joycey in 1906. He buys the Hetton suite of collieries, and he starts to develop this. Now, previously, he and his uncle have been very much involved around the sort of Tanfield, Beamish area. There's that lovely story about my great-grandfather who was having a bit of a tussle with Lord Lambton, who he didn't really particularly regard. Joycey was slightly taking the side of the miners in some position or other. And Lambton apparently turned to him and said, "Oh, well, Mr. Joycey, I expect you know all about that sort of thing," rather dismissive. And my great-grandfather had said to somebody, "I'll remember that remark." And of course, later on, he's actually able to buy Lambton out. What's interesting, I think, just on a purely personal note here, is that having bought Lambton out and having, brought the Lambton Hetton Joycey collieries into being, and the largest coal owner in the world, and 20,000 employees and 6 million tons of coal, his second son marries who? A Lambton. Now, was that a moment of or was that a moment of
Right, let's be honest. The women were knocking the men out of bed to get them to the pit. The women were there, cleaning the clothes, looking after the 6 children, making sure the children were fed and watered, making sure that their husbands had bait to take down the pit. They ran the communities. They ran the community centres. They ran, the community halls, the welfare halls, the churches. So key, hugely significant characters. You don't cross a pitman's wife. So, yeah.
The wives would accept it. I think we did accept things. I never had any ambition. When I left school, I didn't know what I wanted to be, and that was because I think I was happy with and accepted what I had. We didn't question or aspire to anything greater, did we? No.
Even after I was born, my mother worked extremely hard. When she was a young girl, she would work as a domestic servant, and I think girls had done that, before they were married.
Your mum had a routine, hadn't she?
She had. It was hard work. She didn't take a fat lot of notice of us because there was so much to do in the house.
Mm-hmm. After breakfast, you were out during the summer. You were out during the summer, and you didn't come back till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And people didn't worry, they knew you were okay,
Sunday, there was always a roast for dinner. And on Monday, it was washing day. So what was left, obviously she made enough for 2 days, but that was heated up on Monday because Monday was washing day, and washing day was, oh crikey, she used to have to put the whites through a one wash and then in a boiler.
And she had a blue bag.
Ringer, and yes. But we used to have heated, Sunday dinner heated up on a Monday. My dad used to call that Resurrection Day.
When I was a boy, there was only one colliery left in the area. The pit was going 24 hours a day, so at the end of my street where I live, the pit bus, as we would call it, would come 3 times a day, dropping men off, picking men up. Pit life dictated family life. So my grandma was always in the kitchen because there was always somebody coming in from work around that 8-hour cycle.
They were very proud of their houses. They were very clean and tidy, and they would work night and day really, especially if men were on shift. Pans would have to be heated up to have water so the men could have a bath when they got in, and all that sort of thing. So it was a very busy life.
And then Tuesday was ironing.
Yes.
I'm not sure about Wednesday. I remember Thursday was bedrooms.
The ironing, she didn't have a 3-pin plug. She used to plug it into the light.
Oh, did she?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, blimey, that was dangerous, wasn't it?
It was the only thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And Friday, I remember the toilet, the outside toilet, and that toilet was scrubbed every Friday, and I loved that smell because Friday was the last day of school and you was going to have 2 days off, and if the toilet smelt of jizz fluid, it was holiday time. I do the greenhouse now with jizz fluid, and it always reminds me of the toilet every Friday. It was, it was just as people had a coal house and toilet at the bottom of the yard,
Without those sort of social stories, without that sort of the home life stories, it sort of isn't in context, is it? So the men went to work to make the money to provide for their families. So what did them families in turn then benefit from because of their dads, granddads going down the pit? And then don't forget all the women who were in the pit canteens and all the women who were in the pit offices. There was lots of roles within the industry as well that women facilitated too.
They really enjoyed going to chapel. They would go to chapel and they would sing at the chapel with great gusto, and I remember my grandmother saying to me that she didn't like the chapels in my day when they were quiet and respectful. She used to like to go when people used to shout out hallelujah and God save the men at the pigeon trees and all that sort of thing. So they did that, and the chapels did. They had their own societies for putting on plays and that sort of thing.
Oh, the leek show, yes, of course. Used to grow prize leeks.
He won about 3 years and then somebody broke into the garden and with a knife chopped up all the leeks
up.
And they did that twice, which meant that he could no longer grow that leek.
He kept the seeds from the leek,
Up to the age of about 5 or 6, I was living in Hetton mainly, and the Hetton pit, the spoil heap, was just outside the back of where I lived. So as children, we played on the spoil heap. Then we moved into Sunderland and lived in Southwick, which is just over there. And I used to play down the riverside. We used to have dens, children had dens. We made rafts. Rafts, can you imagine, out of bits of timber work, along especially on Timber Beach there, which is called Timber Beach.
We used to go to the beach sometimes. I think it must have been in miners' holidays when my dad was off work. We'd go to Roker. The best bit about that wasn't the seaside, it was the trip on the tram. You went to Sunderland and then you got a tram. We never went to Seaburn, we always went to Roker, didn't we?
We did.
And my dad would get a tent and 2 deck chairs.
Mm-hmm.
And we would wear our knitted bathing costumes, and when they got wet, they all sagged, didn't they?
Yeah, my mum knit them.
Yes.
My family came to this community because of the colliery. So my great-great-grandfather was chief stonemason on the Easton Lane War Memorial, which we commonly known as the Clock. So he worked with the first Lord Joycey in building of the lane clock. His ancestors came from Killingworth in Westmoor, and they were colliery viewers. They lived in the lions' houses that still existed here. They're quite obvious because they're whitewashed, but one of them made a scale model for the Great Exhibition of 1851. And according to John Cook, that's a scale model of Eleanor Colliery, and it was John Wales who built that scale model, which is now in Sunderland Museum, and he was an ancestor of mine.
My dad made me a top and a whip. So I had this top and whip and I'd used it, and I think all the other kids were quite envious. And anyhow, we went off to the pictures at the Cosy at Easington Lane. When we came back, there was a queue at the door, and they'd all come because they wanted a top making. So my father set to, and he made tops for all these kids, and my mother made the whips and put the nails in the end, so the top would spin on the nail. You could have a spinning top or a jumping top, different shapes. And they charged them all a halfpenny each for the top and whip. And that was just a story of the sort of things that people did and the way they cared for each other, and they would do anything to help people.
Hetton, Easington Lane, you had your industry around you, your collieries, you had your railways, and as a child we went down to the Hetton lines, which had closed in the 1950s, but all of the railway was still open, but all the buildings were still there, the tracks were still in, the workshops were still there, and as kids we used to go down there and that was our playground. 14, 41, 13, 12, 33, all the locos we kept at that engine shed. So we would go down and see them. 14 was and 13 its sister was new in 1914 on the Hetton Railway. They replaced 2 earlier engines. So it served all of its time from 1914 to 1959. That locomotive was on that railway, and it was the last locomotive on the southern part of the Hetton Railway. When the Hetton Railway closed in September 59, they started taking the track up from Northmoor, from Ellymore, from Eppleton, working their way right back to Hetton lines, down to the last few feet of track, which was a branch onto the Durham and Sunderland Railway, which is the BR, and number 14 took the last train of wagons with track on, what have you, back down to Lambton. So that was the last loco on the southern part of the Hetton Railway. This is my interpretation of the Hetton Lines Colliery Railway. My playground as a child, my memories, so it's just based literally on what I remember. This is the winding engine from Ellymore Colliery. The headgear, I have the blueprints for it. It's actually designed by the Grange Ironworks, and that was installed at Walker Colliery north of the Tyne, but it's typical of a typical steel headgear for a colliery. Workshops, every colliery had its workshops. This basically roughly Ellymore colliery workshops. In later years, collieries had baths for the pitmen, and this is New Harrington. These are New Harrington baths. Originally, the collieries, the winding engines were worked by steam, and you had Lancashire boilers which supplied the steam for the winders. The engine shed at Hetton Lyons housed all of the engines which worked at Ellymore, Eppleton and Hetton Lyons colliery, and that was the main thing. And they would go out every day to the various collieries and onto the main line to deliver the coal. Typical mining village, you have your shops, your fish shop, your little library, your workmen's club, and the chapels, of course, and the pub. This was built and somebody leaned over and actually knocked the fence down, so we had to have it repaired.
By the 1960s, the Hetton staves and the Lambton staves are in disuse and become dangerous and become a haven for all sorts of people who shouldn't be there and are demolished. And there is very little sign of them today.
In my lifetime, I can just say remember Elmer Colliery, which closed in 1974, but more so Eppleton, which closed in 1986. And even in 1986, most of the men, shall we say, predominantly the men, were employed in the colliery. Not at Eppleton by that stage, but certainly other local collieries in the area. And in the supply chain of that as well. I'm really an optimist at heart, so even though I lived through the strike in 1984 to 1985, my dad was at the pit during the strike. The deprivation that caused, it was just a year to endure, thinking that we'll come out of it and therefore things will return to normal. And of course, within just over a year after the end of the strike, Eppleton Colliery closed. For 150 years, predominantly again the men worked, lived and socialised in the village. And almost overnight that was gone.
It's like a lot of the area, the whole of Durham County was industrial, and it was just there, and you didn't think you thought it would always be there. But of course, as the industry declined, the collieries closed, a lot of the infrastructure disappeared. And in the 50s, 60s and 70s, there's so much disappearing all over the county that people just forgot about it.
As a boy, I would walk the railway line without realising it was the railway, and only later thinking, yes. So from Elmer down to Hetton Lyons, the railway line, from Hetton Lyons round through to the middle of Hetton, as we say, from the middle of Hetton along to Copt Hill. All I knew was it was the line, not realising it was the railway line.
I can remember my grandparents telling me that The railway that was built here was built by George Stephenson, and he was the man that was the father of the railways, and so it was very important, but I didn't really see it as important. It's only as I've looked back really since I've retired that you see how important it was and how things have changed.
To think something of that significance happened here, how could that happen? You know, this sleepy little, at that time probably mining village, how could that happen here?
We never got told about the history when we were kids. We got told about King Arthur burning the cakes and King Harold getting his eye put out. But we never talked about places like this, places that were built by people like us.
There is a definition of history which says, you are where you are because of where you once were. And that's the definition of history that I go by. I cannot claim to be a historian. I didn't really particularly enjoy history at school. I found it boring. I think most kids do find it boring. But as you get older, you suddenly start to think, hey, why are we in this mess or this success or this situation? Because of where we once were.
As the old saying goes, you should never forget your Broughtons up. However your life changes, your early years, it's still there. Youngsters today should know about the history of that area. It's all right to learn about medieval and Roman times, but the immediate history of the 18th, 19th, 20th century should be part of the curriculum, I think, really.
Hetton Lions Country Park, as many of you will already know, spans the sites of the old Hetton and Eppleton collieries. 2022 marks the bicentenary of the sinking of the Hetton colliery and the opening of the Hetton Colliery Railway.
The Hetton Colliery Railway 200 project initially is to raise the profile of the Hetton Colliery Railway. But it's more than that. It's more about influencing the people today, and certainly school children today.
What they wanted to ensure was that there was something for everyone. So it wasn't just those who have a major keen interest in railways. It was about how are we going to educate, how are we going to celebrate science, technology, engineering, maths, how are we going to capture the stories in publications like all of the books that are being published, how are we going to have mass gatherings, so the carnival, Hetton Feast, the Bicentenary conference weekend, and we just went from there.
As a staff, when we've looked at our whole curriculum, we've really tailored it so that we celebrate where our children come from. So it won't just appear in history, it will be talked about across the curriculum. There's a real desire that children have a very strong cultural capital, and they know where they've come from, and they know the impact of that, and they know how that's shaped the past, but also will shape their future.
People lose hope, people lose opportunities, and if we can instill in them something in themselves of that they have a value, they can have a purpose, they can do something meaningful in their life, absolutely that's what we're about. And that's what we've got to make sure that we do.
In this area, we have a lot of generations of families who still live perhaps in the same street or around the corner from each other. So they'll be exposed to that strong sense of belonging and family from the outset. And then really we need to develop that over time and develop their understanding of what that means.
So yes, so we have seen a change in the makeup of our communities, which actually gives us an opportunity to tell others our story. Something we can tell them the kind of community they come to live in, because there's people like myself who've got deep roots in the community.
We did have an important role in history here because of the fact that it was the first complete railway that George Stephenson built. The mine that was sunk here went through the limestone, which was the first time that the coal beneath the limestone had been revealed, and the fact that Thomas Hepburn happened to work here, it's all part of history, and for me it shows how people have to come together and work together.
We're in a tricky place, we're in a really tricky place, but I think because of our background, because of our heritage, we're very resilient communities, and we also have that massive can-do attitude where people rally round, people get together. But again, that's what these projects are so brilliant for, because it gives people an opportunity to celebrate the great things that have happened in the past and consider what they can do in the future as well. What changes can they make? What can they do in their community to support their community?
I think it's about experiences. I think it's about finding that special place in our town where they can touch something or feel something and feel that they are then transported back. The idea of a trail that runs from where we live all the way down into Sunderland is a really exciting prospect for us, because not only is it about the history and the heritage, but we want our children to walk that trail, or certainly parts of that trail, so that they can create the links of where it begins, what it passes through, and where it eventually gets to, and make that kind of close the loop almost about where that train went.
So the brief was to create a replica loco that would be displayed for the Bicentenary. So we were commissioned by Norfolk Street Arts, and in that we were going to work with children from all across the coalfields area to create individual fused glass pieces that would celebrate the project and through the railways, through our shared history, culture and heritage, and from what we did there, each individual piece of glass that children made were put together, and that then went into the locomotive.
That is just amazing for our children, and they'll look at it so intently that they will identify which tiny part of that thing belongs to them. So it's that full loop.
It blew my mind. It was a lot better than what any of us could have envisioned. The way it came together, it just worked perfectly. There's so many rich colours involved, the structure of it. It just worked so well, and everyone involved in it just sort of took a step back, and it was something that we're really proud of, something that, we're just proud and relieved that it had turned out to be such a success.
In places like our towns and villages, children quite often don't get to travel so far and don't get those other experiences, don't get those cultural experiences, so to understand the world around them in their little sort of microclimate is key.
We will exploit any way that we can encourage our children to learn. We'll tap into how best they will learn and remember it, because what we want primary school, Hetton Primary School, to offer our children is that really rich, memorable experience that they will take forward with them and remember.
It brings the curriculum to life when you've got different people going in and you've got different props and you're using different platforms. So for example, doing the glass artwork, the kids think they're doing artwork, but they're not, they're having a history lesson. And they're also getting to do something that ordinarily the school probably wouldn't be able to afford to resource, and seeing different professionals. So can you imagine going into a classroom and having a professional artist sit with you?
And it's a fun way to learn, so they're getting creative and absorbing all of this information about the area that they live, they've grown up in, and the role that the coal fields, in particular Hetton, played in shaping the railways as we know it today.
I'd like to know on behalf of the trustees of Hetton Colliery Railway 200 to this landmark event.
We are here to celebrate the Hetton Colliery Railway 200 because, of course, without Hetton, nothing else would have happened.
I think for our children to realise that there was a bit of a revolutionary period that happened right here has got to be an inspiration.
It's part of your personal journey, isn't it? And I think that understanding the world around us is a key thing.
There's almost a sense of pride as well, really, to think that something so influential could come from a place so obscure, really. Without Hetton, George Stephenson wouldn't have gone to Stockton-Darlington. He wouldn't have gone to Liverpool or Manchester.
forget about the diminished treatment that Hetton has had in the historiography of railways. Because you've had this conference, take your banner and go out and fight for Hetton.